All right, so he's the writer of countless books, some that have been turned into movies and series such as Coraline, American Gods, Good Omens, and his latest thing on Netflix is his graphic novel Sandman. So he's done more than write books. He's also written for one of my favorites, Doctor Who. And like Doctor Who, Radioland stories and books transport us to other realms, which is why it's not such a surprise that author Neil Gaiman is a fan of old time radio, but he's especially a fan of Jack Benny. So today we're welcoming Neil Gaiman. Hello.
Thank you, Hope. It's lovely to be here.
Nice. So, how did you first find Jack Benny?
I found, well, my first recollection of Jack would be watching on British television an 80 from memory, it was an 80th birthday TV special. And all I particularly remember is that everybody else in it was incredibly old and Jack was twinkling around unaged. And I remember just sort of saying to my dad, okay, who is this guy? What are we watching? Why are we watching it? And Dad saying, okay, this is Jack Benny. He's an American comedian. His shtick is he's incredibly mean and he plays the violin very badly. And I'm like, doesn't really seem like the grounds for a building a giant comedy reputation on, but okay, 10 years old, I'll take that. And then somewhere around, I don't know, 1996, 97, I loved radio. I'd always loved radio. I'd always loved radio plays. I'd always loved radio drama. As far as I was concerned, radio was one of the coolest things you could ever do. My first real book was a sort of semi-biography of Douglas Adams and a companion to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, talking about how it had become what it had become. So I'd known my British radio very well. And I think one of my kids got me for Christmas in the mid-90s a CD collection of old-time radio. And I happily listened to my way through all of that old-time radio and going, okay, this is so interesting because this is American radio. I don't really know very much about it. I missed it completely. And so it was interesting for me because as a kid and as a teenager and just growing up in the UK, BBC originally, the home service, the light program when I was a kid, and then BBC Radio 4 from when I was, I don't know, sort of 8, 9 years old on, they were omnipresent. They were things that I knew, I understood. You had a world in which there was radio drama, radio comedy and stuff. And then coming to America, it felt like that had completely gone away. And I seem to remember at some point what may have prompted the entire thing, getting the old-time radio thing, was me being snotty and British in conversation with somebody or other that I respected, like Gene Wolfe, and saying, why don't you, the great radio drama was all British, the great radio comedy was British, and getting you should listen to Jack Benny. And so I was primed. And I listened to this, 40 CD old time radio thing and was fascinated by all of it and in love with Jack Benny, and also had no context and did something that you could only do back then in those early days of the web, which was I went to actually you may be able to do it now, but it was all very exciting back then because eBay had just started and all that. and I wound up on eBay and bought a CD/DVD with the complete Benny show plus a whole load of other stuff on it.
Yeah.
And it arrived, and I listened to everything. Yeah. And it became my sort of, it was what I would listen to at night before I went to sleep every night. And, sort of rapidly went, okay, the 30s stuff I have problems with. Early 40s stuff improves very quickly. And then somewhere around, I don't know, 1943, it's as if, you get new writers again, and it takes off and it flies. And until about 55, it just becomes magic. And I would listen to everything else on there and all the extra bits, and here's Jack's appearances on Fred Allen, and here's Jack's appearances on various different shows, and so on and so forth. Okay, no, I get it all. But this thing, there was a special thing that happened in there, and that I found, I just did a deep dive into, and it could, I was caught.
Yeah.
And at that point, I was buying all of the books by everybody I could find on Jack, and I was reading the books by Hilliard Marks and by, by ex-agents and people, and I'm just trying to get a sense of, okay, who are you? And how do you become you? And what came together? And how did that happen? And then there's a level on which I also get fascinated, because once you understand what that was and what it did, you can also then sort of see how it affected the rest of the world. Shows, in the UK, there's an entire sort of sitcom world created because Gorton and Simpson loved Jack Benny, and they wanted to do that, which is how come we got the Tony Hancock stuff over here, and that then becomes something else. But it's all incredibly, everybody sort of learned from doing that, or from watching that, loving it.
You are describing a similar experience to, I think, a lot of us, how we found Jack as kind of being primed for that. Our first meeting with Jack Benny was maybe not when we jumped in. I know it's true for Laura, it's true for me. I found Jack Benny, I was reading a book on a salon table, and it wasn't really interesting to me until I really liked comedy in general. So then I explored, I bought a Johnny Carson set, and it was Johnny Carson and Friends, and the Jack Benny episodes were really interesting. Laura, did you want to kind of explain how a lot of us got into Jack Benny through your experiences? This one that I feel like a lot of people do.
Oh, it's funny. Just to quickly pick this up before I forget it, I know the exact bit that you're talking about. It's from the Jack Benny 20th anniversary TV special. And yeah, you have each one of the cast members coming in Rochester, and they're old and wizened and gray and so forth. And then Jack comes kind of skipping down the stairs, and he's still 39, or still hasn't aged. So, in fact, Zach, just comment to you, we may want to take that bit and drop it in here just to illustrate what Neil was talking about. And I'm more than happy to send you the episode or direct you to it. It may be on YouTube right now.
Yep, I'm pulling it up right now, actually.
Cool. Just so you can relive that. But yeah, I actually my first exposure was through the cartoon The Mouse That Jack Built. They were looking to kind of redo the radio shows as animated cartoons. and all the originals did the voices and so forth. And then, yeah, you just kind of, I mean, I saw that when I was 3 years old, but then later, I'm a late bloomer with Jack. I think we all got into Jack about when we were 10. There's something about being 10. And yeah, exactly what you said. You start looking for the biographies, you start trying to get the shows and so forth. So yeah, I resonate with that. So
Yeah.
And I love the way that every now and then I will run into people and suddenly, and I'm not even quite sure how it happened, we're having a deep conversation about the Dennis Day years or whatever.
Mhm.
And you're going, how? I didn't, you're a famous literary critic. Why, how did we find this?
Mhm.
And now suddenly we're like stamp collectors. And
Oh
you
God,
trade,
yes.
and you also wind up trading tiny bits of information. You trade things that give things context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This morning, my assistant here in New Zealand said to me, so, who is Jack Benny? Why are you doing this? Who is he? And I wound up just sort of trying to begin with putting Jack into context. And 5 minutes later, I'm listening to myself talking about, the effects of Carole Lombard's death on To Be or Not to Be, and on how making a joke of The Horn Blows at Midnight being a bad movie actually basically ended Jack's film career for a shtick. And, there is and I'm like, why, how did we get here so fast?
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't imagine having that conversation about Groucho Marx or Bob Hope or somebody. But with those people, you always feel that there was I've known a lot of comedians, and most comedians, I wind up sort of, let me start this somewhere else. Horror writers of horror. I have spent a lot of time around writers of horror, and sometimes write horror myself. Not really, but I can do it if I want. I know a lot of horror writers socially, and people go, whoa, those people must be really messed up. And you want to go, no, they get it all out on the paper. They're funny and they're lovely. People who write comedy, they're dark. That's where the darkness goes. And whenever I read about anybody else, I'm always fascinated by how deep the darkness goes. You look at Groucho Marx, you look at Bob Hope, you go, no, these people they're dark people, they're twisted, they're taking something and using it to make it funny. And then you've got Jack, who, as far as I can tell, is lovely all the way down. Seems to have been able to create a persona that embodied all human weakness, venality, sin, and what makes us all flawed and dangerous, because unlike all of the others, he wasn't desperately trying to make up for some hole in his personality. That, it's that thing of people love writing for and being on Jack's shows, because if they got a laugh, he was very happy for them to get the laugh. And whereas there are other people who were famous for, if somebody else gets a laugh, they want that line now. As far as Jack was
Craig
concerned,
Nelson had told me about how he'd be on the Eddie Cantor show, and then some that you do the read through in front of the audience and you'd get a laugh, and then when you went to the live show, then they'd have taken that line away from you. So
exactly. Whereas Jack seems to, there's a generosity of spirit that seems to go all the way through. I mean, you don't go into Jack looking for looking for the darkness, looking for the flaws, you're actually kind of reassured that somebody who seems to have actually been a perfectly decent human being had a lovely career and did what he wanted and was, you know, I love the fact that the nearest to the darkness I've ever heard anybody say, who actually knew him, as opposed to people hypothesizing about him, but was being told once that he put boot black on his hair, on his head before he went on live, because it was so much easier than either dyeing his hair or trying to wear a wig, actually wearing a wig or anything. He just sort of boot black over his hair, and that way, thinning white hair, nobody ever noticed it on the which I just thought was hilarious. And
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I hope I'm sorry to barge
Oh, you're
into
fine.
this.
You're fine. We're all talking about Jack here.
This is true.
Yeah. And you've written a story, The Man Who Forgot Ray Bradbury, and it mentions Jack Benny and references the Fahrenheit 451 scene where people are kind of just wandering, reciting and remembering words of plays and books. Do you feel like there are people that are destined to remember people like Jack Benny?
It definitely makes me, on the one hand, sad that Jack is fading away. And on the other hand, I love the fact that the people who love Jack can find Jack now. We you know, the idea of a world in which somebody could have sent me, you know, a tape with Jack on it. And in fact, I love the fact that I've just remembered where I got my first Jack from. And I'm going to give her a shout out because I got it wrong before. It was the person, and I said maybe it was Gene Moore. It wasn't. It was Maggie Thompson. And it was Maggie Thompson of Maggie and Don Thompson, editor at the time of the Comics Buyer's Guide. And I'd recently moved to Wisconsin. And Maggie Thompson sent me my first tape of Jack. And again, it was that kind of thing where I'm just like, I don't know what I'm listening to, but I'm loving it. So she would have been first, and then everything else would have been second. But the idea that I could have got, you know, that anybody could get the complete Jack Benny audio, that we're actually now in a world where you can watch everything we've got at the TV. I love the fact that that stuff is now there for us, that you know, there is information that is findable.
Yeah.
And that so and yes, I do kind of feel like, you know, knowing and loving Jack is a responsibility. It will make me sad if I come to the end of my life and I'm on my deathbed and I go, you know, I never wrote the Jack Benny thing. I would like to have written something about Jack. I did a sort of I've got 7 or 8 pages somewhere of a thing with somebody who is obviously based on Jack, and the idea of trying to do something that's both, you know, that starts in the late 20s or early 30s in the very early days of radio, and then comes through till the days when television is killing radio.
Yeah.
And it would be nice to finish it, or you know.
Is it one of those ideas that is still kind of like in the process of growing for you?
In some ways, I wound up researching. Every now and then, if I get obsessed, with things and I don't notice I've got obsessed, I can research too much.
Yeah.
And I kind of think it's one of those things where I think I would have been better off writing it when I knew a little, and at the point where I'm like, oh, I know everything about all of this stuff, or at least as much as anybody now can be said to know. You know, there are moments where you do feel like you know too much.
Yeah, you get in the weeds and you don't. It's better to flesh the idea out, first before you do add the details. Yeah, I get that.
I think so. And
Yeah.
also there's that weird point where you actually wind up knowing the people kind of so well, you actually start taking a dislike to some of them.
Yeah.
Which is a terrible thing. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I remember the moment where somebody talking to any family member and talking about the death of Mary Livingston and what their adopted daughters, and she said, the person said to me, she said, do you know what their adopted daughter's reaction to hearing of Mary's death was? And I said, well, probably singing Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead. And there was a, how did you know that? And I went, well, you know these people too well at this point. I've read too many books. I kind of, you know, the only person who loved Mary Livingston was Jack, and he loved her very much. But she was a monster. And so obviously.
You know, you were talking about getting in the weeds, and just in the minutes before you came on, we were talking about the crossover between Jack Benny fandom and Doctor Who fandom, because there actually is a lot of connection there. And I'm going to throw it back to Hope to pursue that line of thought. If that's
okay. She really wants me to cover that.
Let's do
it. Cool. Do it.
It is. So I didn't really have a whole lot of questions about that, because I feel like we might get too much in the weeds, because I am a huge Doctor Who fan, as both Laura and I are. But do you think it is does it come as a surprise that a lot of people that do like old time radio are also fans of a show like Doctor Who?
Oh, not at all. I mean, if you like old time radio, you also are probably, you have to have the kind of mind which loves huge and complex continuities. You know, the fact that you can listen to a Jack Benny show and delight in the fact that, oh my gosh, because nothing was repeated back then, they're just rolling out this script. They don't have a script right now, so they've pulled out the one from 1941 and they're doing it again, and they haven't revised it, and they're going to get into trouble or whatever. You know, that kind of stuff is fascinating, and Doctor Who is made for people who love giant, long, ongoing narratives that manage, you know, by dint of having been around for 60 years, by dint of having every actor in the UK on Doctor Who at some point or other, it becomes, you know, it's like a game, the Kevin Bacon game. You're just one step, you're always one step away from Doctor Who. So it doesn't surprise me at all that and also Doctor Who is funny.
It is.
And and it has that same, there is a gentleness and a Benny-esque humor. I mean, Jack would have been a great Doctor.
Yeah, I especially think among the early Doctors, yes, he would have been a good Doctor. You wrote an episode of Doctor Who with the Cybermen. And Jack and I was just thinking of, we have these classic Cybermen and Daleks, we have these classic villains, but we also have, in the Jack Benny fandom, we have the feud with Fred Allen. What makes for a good foe?
Well, actually, what I love best about the Benny shows is the best foe. I mean, the villain in a good Jack Benny show is Jack, which I think is the funniest and best thing about it. Some of the, occasionally he'll be the hero, but it's absolutely, Jack's sort of human ways what make him such a fabulous villain. And then he sort of, he builds. I think good villains should come back. Good villains should be memorable. Good villains, Daleks and Cybermen tend to be very humorless, and part of the fun of that is that you've got utterly humorless adversaries against a humor-filled and somebody, against the Doctor who understands and uses humor.
So the straight man and the comedian there.
Absolutely. They, Daleks are always straight men.
Yeah.
So I think that's a real dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also, one of the lovely things about the Doctor is funny when the Doctor needs to be.
Mm-hmm.
But again, evolved to that point. It wasn't, the first Doctor wasn't funny. William Hartnell was just terrifying. I remember him as a tiny kid. He was like,
yeah,
he was this terrifying grandfather. And then Patrick Troughton turned up, and he was funny. And he was kind of sweet and goofy. And then John Pertwee turned up, and he was dashing. And then Tom Baker turned up, and he was goofier by far than anybody else, and funnier, but you weren't sure if he ever knew that he was making a joke. And watching the Doctors from then on, they do tend to, they know that the world is funny. They know the universe is big and funny.
Mm-hmm.
With Jack, I think that he would build especially once the scripts really hit their prime. He's not the straight man. He's not the comedian. He is this sort of, and it's kind of up to it's up to us how much we're willing to embrace him, how much we'll listen to Rochester, whose portrait of Benny is something monstrous and barely human. This is a Jack who can forget to bleed when his throat gets cut. This is, you move into those sort of amazing territories of Jack's vault. and you're suddenly going, okay, we're kind of in science fiction territory here. How old is this Jack? Jack is 39, but Jack, at least in some gags, must have been 39 for hundreds of years, because the guard on his vault has been working for him at least that long. So you get sort of, can build up a lovely sort of science fictional rationale for Jack Benny as well.
Yeah, I definitely see that. I was telling my dad the other day, I feel like Jack Benny was the Larry King of, like, he seemed the same age forever, but there's also jokes that he could also be a dinosaur. Like, you don't know how old he is. But
I love the way that jokes, there's something fundamentally incredibly Darwinian about Jack and jokes, in that, I think I seem to remember that they started at about 36 with how old Jack was, and they moved that forward to 37, and they moved that forward to 38, and they moved that forward to 39, and that was as funny as it was ever going to get, so they stayed there.
yeah,
And you can watch gags and personae and bits kind of evolving out of this week to week stuff, and if it works and if it sticks, then it comes back next week, and then if it really sticks, it becomes a sort of integral part of what the Jack Benny show was.
yeah, you definitely see that a lot. With like the science fiction and like this kind of fantasy element, going back a little bit to Ray Bradbury, you have two people coming from Waukegan that have such stories and such note. Do you think that there's a connection between a community like kind of a small town but kind of outside of a larger city? Do you think there's something to that kind of middle America connection that they both had?
Yeah, I do. I mean, Bradbury gets to paint a fabulous portrait of Waukegan in the years that Bradbury and Jack would have known it. In his, well, Jack would have been before Bradbury, obviously, but you look at things like books like Dandelion Wine and Greentown, Illinois is Waukegan. And so you get a kind of picture of what this town was back then. But I also think, one thing that Ray, unlike most science fiction writers of his generation, didn't have, which Jack did, of course, was the Jewishness. Because Ray is wonderfully, gloriously waspy, and that is, part of his magic and part of what works. With Jack, I think the Jewish humor, the immigrant humor, is an enormous part of who he was and what he was. And of course was something that really, then even though on the show he would happily bring on characters who were very obviously Jewish stereotypes or Jewish based, but whereas the Jack Benny character is, you definitely get the impression he's probably some kind of wasp.
Yeah, there's definitely drawing from some of those influences, like with Mr. Kitzel and all of those characters. So it is an interesting dynamic that I do enjoy to see. If nothing else, for just knowing that it existed.
Yeah.
Because you don't really even see that so much anymore. You know, for better or worse, but
I think there are definitely there are things that have gone. I was rereading recently Peter Beagle's beautiful novel, A Fine and Private Place, and a book I'd read as a boy and loved and wanted to write an introduction to, and now was rereading for the first time in 30 years, and realizing that one of the things in the book that I hadn't really understood when I read it when I was 12 or whatever was there's a lady, Mrs. Clapper, Gertrude Clapper, in it, and not only is she incredibly Jewish, but she's talking in a way that I think you would have to go to Florida and hang around some very old folks' homes, you know, to hear people even possibly talking like that now.
yeah.
There are just ways of talking. There are speech patterns that have kind of become extinct.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lost kind of common culture there. Yeah. You have often worked the theme of names into your books. I've noticed that a lot. The importance of names is pretty prevalent. When you hear people that are my age not knowing the name Jack Benny, what does that mean to you?
It, there's definitely a little bit of sadness involved, but I'm always reminded of that XKCD strip about things people don't know, and things, you know, when you mention something that you think that everybody knows and somebody's like, I have no idea what you're talking about, for me that's a wonderful opportunity to say to them, oh, you don't know, oh, let me tell you, and furthermore, let me give you a list of things that you need to watch. And okay, have you ever heard of a film called To Be or Not to Be? Okay, don't bother with the Mel Brooks version. Do not watch the Mel Brooks one. However, the original To Be or Not to Be is such an amazing film, and you have to go and watch that. And then when you watch that, come back and I'll give you a list of things to listen to, you know, because you get so for me, I think there is the excited and excitable willingness when people confess themselves completely blank, to just start telling them things. And you know,
Yeah.
in my office at home, I'm currently about 9,000 miles away from home, but in my office at home I have a little shelf, and on it I have a Groucho Marx statue that I bought with the first real money that I'd earned that I could spend on something that wasn't just food, transport, or a roof over my head. And I bought this ugly big-headed Groucho Marx puppet sort of model. And a year or so later, I bought A Bride of Frankenstein to keep it company. And they just sit there on the shelf looking down at me, reminding me not to take myself too seriously, reminding me that it's, you know, don't worry about it. It's all kind of funny. And
Yeah.
And in 100 years, it's all going to be really funny. And the fact that I'll talk to people now, people come into my office and they'll see the Groucho and they're like, oh, who's that? I'm like, oh, it's Groucho Marx.
Yeah.
Marx Brothers, funny, and I'm realizing that there are things that I took for granted that everybody knew. Jack, in his own strange way, is a little obscure. And that's okay. And it's fine to me that not everybody's heard of Jack or listened to the radio show or whatever, because why would they? This is something that was made 80, 90 years ago. It's okay. But I just have to, so I have to view it always as an opportunity to evangelize, and knowing that if I tell 100 people about something that I love, maybe one of them will go and pick it up. I did a whole book called The View from the Cheap Seats, which was a book of nonfiction. It was a collection of essays, of introductions, of articles, things that I'd written. And one of the main reasons for writing it was it's filled with things I love. And I get so thrilled when somebody drops me a email or something and says, look, I was reading your book and you did an article on They Might Be Giants' album Flood for its 20th anniversary or 25th anniversary release. And so I went and read it. I listened to it, and now I love They Might Be Giants. I'm like, oh, that's so good. You found something through me. And that really is kind of how I feel about that book. And it's kind of how I feel about, my love for things like Jack, for old time comedy, for old time radio. But I'm also fascinated right now with the fact that with the BBC Sound app, you can head off into comedy, and there are some things where they've put some things up, and there are some things where they've left everything up. Whether they've noticed they've left everything up or not, I'm not even certain. But you can listen to the whole of Andy Hamilton's Old Harry's Game. You can listen to, I think, the whole of Hancock's Half Hour. All of this stuff that was great comedy of past eras is there. And I run into more and more people now who are getting used to the idea of podcasts, getting used to the idea of listening to things. And when you say to them, you can listen to the whole of Round the Horn or whatever, they get excited and they get interested. And they'll go off and listen to it in a way that 20 years ago, telling somebody, hey, I've got 70 hours of old radio for you to listen to, it would have been like, is this a joke or is this torture? Now we have a culture in which that kind of comes back again.
Yeah. And like Lauren Bacall had a good quote about that. She's like, well, she was being asked, like, well, new people are discovering you, and she said, it's like, how do you feel about it? Like, this is so old, all this old work. And she's like, it's new to them. So it's just that new discovery for a whole different generation. They're kind of doing their own exploration. So that, I think that's kind of what is happening here.
I mean, you talked about Doctor Who earlier, and I think one thing that we didn't touch on, which is kind of important, is Doctor Who starts in 1963. And one of the best things about it is that it reinvents itself every few years, because there is always a generation of 9, 10, 11-year-olds who are just brave enough now to start watching Doctor Who, and they don't want to watch their big brother or their dad's show or their big sisters or their mum's show. they want to watch their show. And for some of them, that's enough. But for a lot of them, it's like the sudden realization that, oh my gosh, this thing goes back all the way.
Mm-hmm.
And you can take it as far as you like, and you can dive into it as deeply as you like.
Yes, that is exactly our exact words. It's like it's one of those shows that you can be as involved or not as involved as you would like. There's all kinds of things. And you talked about radio plays and such do you think podcasts are kind of helping bring back those radio plays?
Yeah, enormously. So my personal history with radio is, I think the first radio adaptation I ever did would have been really early 90s for something called Seeing Ear Theater that the Sci-Fi Channel was doing. And it was an enormous failure. And it was an enormous failure because there wasn't a way to tell people that this existed, and nobody knew how to listen to it. And you had to sit in front of your computer and find the MP3 file and then click on it and sit there and listen. And this did not work. I did a couple of radio plays in the 90s for the BBC that were fun. And then in about 2012, started doing adaptations with the BBC again and working with Dirk Maggs and with Heather Lama on doing things like Neverwhere and Good Omens and so forth as radio dramas.
Mm-hmm.
Which then set us up for a world in which we got to do Sandman for Audible. And we'd been pitching Sandman to the BBC, Dirk Maggs and I, since 1993, maybe 92.
Yeah.
But then. And they've been saying no consistently. Mm-hmm. And we got to do it for Audible. And it became the biggest thing that Audible has ever done. It sold faster and better than the Harry Potter books. It became this absolute phenomenon. And I look at that and I go, we're not really doing anything particularly different to what I did when I did Snowglass Apples and Murder Mysteries for Seeing Ear Theater circa, I don't know, 1994, 1995. But now we have a generation that knows that if you're going for a drive or you're traveling or you're just doing something, or vacuum cleaning the house, doing something you need your hands for and you need your eyes for, but you don't need your ears and your brain for, that there are stories waiting for you, and that's fabulous. And that gave us this amazing audience for Sandman in audio.
Yeah. People know where to get it now too. It's I feel as the web kind of progressed, so did people's awareness of where things were at. So that's definitely good to see. And I just wanted to kind of also revisit some of the comedy. Is it harder for you to write comedy or drama?
Drama is always easier. Comedy has to actually be funny. Mm-hmm. And so, there's, for me, the worst thing in the world, and I don't see many of them anymore because TV for me, obviously, like most people, has become a lot more intentional. But I remember the days when the TV would be on and you would be watching a sitcom and you would get the laughter, the canned laughter, to tell you where the jokes were meant to be. And you go, there wasn't actually anything funny about that joke. That was like, nobody's laughing because they think that's funny. They're laughing because what was said kind of had the shape of a joke. And so they knew that that's the point where you laugh. But it wasn't funny. Writing Good Omens for me and doing the Good Omens TV series, the humor is always the hardest part. And it's the hardest part in a lot of ways because nobody's really allowed ever to make a joke. It has to be funny. But it has to be that weird kind of funny that happens when you like the people and you like the intersection of what they're saying and what they're doing and what they're thinking. And all of those things feel real and feel true. And oh my God, I can't believe they actually said that. And then it gets funny. And that's kind of what you're always going for.
Yeah.
And, you know, there are a few places in Good Omens season 2 where I really feel like, okay, we've done that thing just flies. And some of that also is because, you know, we spent season 1 getting to know the characters and going, well, what works and what doesn't work. And again, it's that weird sort of Darwinian thing of, okay, I like that thing that you do, that's really good. Okay, let's do more of that, but let's do less of this stuff over here that didn't really.
It's one of the things that I was finding interesting when I was kind of looking up. I read Good Omens and then I was looking up, just doing a search on the internet, one reviewer, and I thought this was just so uncanny that this came up as a result. One reviewer of Good Omens back in like I don't remember, it was in the 1990s.
It was if you're going where I think you're going, it may be Howard Waldrop, who was a science fiction writer in his own right, reviewing in probably 1990, in October 1990.
Yes, or it said it's essentially a completely revamped version of the Horn Blows at Midnight,
Yeah.
which I had to think about it for a second, and it is completely its own thing, but it does have that, oh yeah, we have the angels and they're out to prevent the end of the world. So what do you think when you hear a review like that? Like,
oh, I loved it.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think at the time, I don't think I'd ever read The Horn Blows at Midnight. I'd never seen it. And I think, and I'm not even sure that I knew that it was the famous, you know, Jack's go-to joke about movies and things. But I love that. I was very disappointed when I finally saw it. Because there were moments in it that I loved, and then the whole, you know, anything that ends and it's just a dream, leaves the audience feeling cheated. You know, if you realize there were no stakes in this after all, and that really is kind of how Horn Blows feels when you get to the end of it.
Yeah.
But I love that. I love the comparison.
Yeah.
Most of all, I love that Howard Waldrop was the one to make it, because you know, he's a writer whose work I loved.
I was, when I was reading that, I was like, well, I don't think David Tennant will have the same problem that Jack had with Good Omens. I was like, but I didn't know if anybody else had made that connection and was like leery about putting it on screen because I think that's far enough in the past that people had forgotten about that.
Oh, I mean, you know, the tragedy of The Horn Blows at Midnight is it is, you know, you have to dig deep in order to get to see it.
Mhm.
It is so forgotten. And when I watched it, I definitely found myself,
I don't want to interrupt, but if you are looking for it, it can be found over Warner Archive.
excellent.
Yeah.
But it's also one of those things where I was, you know, I love the idea of it, and just wish that it had been done better. It's one of those films that feels like it's really going somewhere and then it stops.
Yeah, it was pretty abrupt. Yeah. It was definitely it definitely felt abrupt and it is you do feel cheated because it is just it's just a dream.
I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Jack had been able to take whatever the magic was of where he had his, you know, the best writers, and actually do that thing as a movie somehow. But also, you know, I think the problem with the Jack Benny of that era is he has to be both hero and villain. You know, it's why To Be or Not to Be works so beautifully. Is that Jack is kind of a monster. The character, the actor manager that Jack is playing, in his own way. And, you know, he's one of these gloriously flawed Jack Benny characters.
Yeah. He has the flaws and then he has the redeeming moments that makes it tolerable. Because otherwise he is a kind of an unlikable character, but he has that balance. For the
I always felt like one of the things they got right on the radio when they figured it out was making Jack, on the one hand, could pretty much be a cartoon, you know, a cartoon evil miser, like the Mean Old Man episode. And on the other hand, there's a vulnerability and a childlike quality to the Jack Benny character. He's very easy to hurt. He's, you know, he's a monster on the one hand, and on the other hand, he's this little kid who just really wants to be loved by everybody. And they make that work so beautifully.
Yeah. With the kind of legends of and these just kind of easily callbacks to the Horn Blows at Midnight, his age and such. A lot of times we can act as historians in this group, a lot of times looking up the radio days, but as Laura can also attest to, we deal in facts, but these are entertainers. And sometimes they ignore the facts of their own lives. How do you feel about that phrase, when legend becomes fact, print the legend?
Oh, I think that's going to happen anyway.
Yeah.
And I think you know, in Jack's case, there's a lot that we don't know. And there's some things that we do know. And there are huge, vast swathes of Jack's private life that he actually managed to keep private somehow. You know, there are bits of things that get sort of hinted at in other people's anecdotes. there were George Burns anecdotes after Jack died, where you're like, oh, hang on, there's biographical stuff under that. That's really interesting, but nobody ever quite went there. And but I think, of course, you print the legend. And Jack, like all of them, made himself up as he went along. You got press people telling stories about who he was. You got interviews where things were shaved down or elided. The fundamental stories, I'm assuming, are true, and a lot of the stories about who he was are true. But I like the fact that nobody needs to do a dark tell-all of the final days of Jack Benny, in the same way that, I was reading the lovely one, the title of which I have, of course, just forgotten, Raised Eyebrows, about Groucho's last day.
Steve Stollier's book, yeah.
And it's love, and also I cannot recommend his audio book of it highly enough, because he does a stunning impression of what it must have been like to have Groucho around and talking to you, and this slightly weak, elderly, Jewish gentleman kvetching in the background and stuff. And it's magical. Jack isn't that. I mean, I don't think there's anything that harms anybody about printing the legend, but also, what's lovely about Jack is you do have a kind of rounded picture of him. On the one hand, you have Jack Benny the miser as part of the legend. On the other hand, you have that lovely anecdote about the, people refusing to be tipped by Jack because they'd rather keep their dreams, and about how Jack always over-tipped because he was terrified people would actually think he was a miser in real life. And I love the fact that there's this sort of weird intersection of legend and person there.
Yeah. Laura, actually, when she first started, if correct me if I'm wrong, Laura, but you kind of got famous for correcting the AP who printed the legend and not the facts about how Jack met Mary when is that correct?
Well, I wouldn't say that I became famous,
famous.
especially not in this company. But yeah, when Mary died in '83, and they said, "Oh, and Jack met Mary at the May Company," and told that whole story, and then I wrote a letter to the AP, saying, "Excuse me, no." And then I cited the biographies and so forth, and as my high school was demanding at the time, I footnoted them in the letter, and so then the AP sent a reporter out to talk to me, and it ended up in a nationally distributed AP story. So go figure.
That's lovely. And of course, then there's the little weird footnote, which was that she was meant to have been related to the Marx Brothers.
Oh God, don't go there. Oh man,
no. I was going to say, in terms of untrue things, you have the first layer, which is May Company, where you go, no, yeah, that was just that story. And then you get the other bit, which is, and she was Marx Brothers, which I even in the story, the man who forgot Ray Bradbury, I even put in that she was not.
Thank you.
Sadie Marx was not related to the Marx Brothers. Just as a tiny little footnote going, there are maybe only 5 people on the planet that this line will make happy, but it will make all of them very happy indeed.
I'm one of them. I think
you guys mean you mean Sadio isn't real?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's actually one of my pet peeves, and I keep. That legend keeps coming around. It's like, no, she would no. So yeah.
It is one of the first things that I encountered, and it's strange how like knowledgeable people about Jack will still cite it as fact. So like you get, okay, well, is it like if you're just starting to find Jack, you're kind of like, is this real or not? Because there's so many people that will cite either side. But does showbiz myths, legends, or lore kind of interest you the same way that something like mythology does?
No, it really doesn't. I mean, Jack was one of those very few things where I'm suddenly got hooked on, and it wasn't, and I was, very much less interested in the giant showbiz lore of it all than I was in the okay, what do these stories tell me about this person? The story, George Burns's story about Jack signing his $1 million deal and finding out from having signed his $1 million deal that if you drove at 29 miles an hour, you'd get all of the green lights. And it's like, and I love that story. There's something wonderful about George going, you signed $1 million deal, and Jack going, and if you drive at 29 miles an hour, you hit the green lights all the way. And I'm like, I love what it tells us about people and about what it means to be human. I love opening stuff up I hadn't known, learning about Jack's refusal to stay in or to let any of his team stay in any hotels that would not allow Rochester to stay. Fascinate me.
People, I mean, that is a whole crew of people, and so having like one of the most famous comedians walk out of your hotel and probably having to explain why, that's not good for whoever owns that hotel. So
maybe what I love about it is maybe it changed some minds, maybe it did some good, but if nothing else, it tells us what side Jack was on. And there doesn't seem to be any time where you go down that giant list and you go, no, you were on the wrong side. He was on the right side all the way.
He seems pretty consistently a good guy.
Yeah.
So I'm almost out of questions, so I'll ask you this. Who is Jack Benny to you, and what does he mean to you?
What a great question. Well, all through my 40s, Jack was my best way of getting to sleep. And now I'm in my 60s. If I'm actually really, really stuck and cannot get to sleep, I will go back and play a Jack Benny show, secure in the knowledge that I will never make it to the musical number. And a lot of that is because I know all of the jokes, I know all of the lines, I know every musical cue, I know every advert, and there's just something very familiar. Listening to a Jack Benny show for me these days, it's like going home, and going home to a home that you used to go to a long time ago that isn't there anymore, but this one magically still is. And it's also one of those places where I feel like I'm always fascinated by the intersection between craft and art. And the Jack Benny radio shows, more than anything for me, were they're where craft meets art. They're people working hard week in, week out against nightmarish deadlines to craft something that will work on radio, that will sell ads, that will not get cancelled. And somehow in there, they make art, and they make something that actually makes you kind of feel kind of proud to be human. As particularly the Jack character and the characters around him all become very, very real and consistent and part of a giant story that works.
Yeah. That's a good overall explanation of Jack. So thank you so much. I also just want to apologize for liking every Jack Benny thing on Tumblr that you've ever posted at like midnight. So
I'm glad somebody has.
yeah. So thank you so much for talking with us.
I wanted to share this with you, Neil, before we go, because you mentioned the first time you encountered Jack.
By so fast, and before you know it, it'll be another 20 years. Gee, imagine 20 years from now. I can just picture it. 20 years from now.
Hello, Jack. Rochester. Oh, yes, these old eyes are playing me tricks.
Your ears are doing the same, too.
Yeah. Oh, my goodness. I forgot about Dennis Day. Come in, Denny.
Here's my hat, and here's my... Oh, I got a seizure. Here you are, my sweater, and my bicycle clips.
Clips? When did you get a bicycle?
Oh, I didn't. I used them to keep my varicose veins together.
This is Bob, Road to Medicare Hope. A funny thing happened to me on the way over here. I made it. Dennis, I thought you were going to pick me up.
I was, but I stopped at the hospital to visit my wife.
Oh, how is Peggy getting along?
Oh, she's fine. The baby weighed 8 pounds, 3 ounces.
Tell Crosby, he'll kill himself.
Come in.
Hi, everybody.
Hello, Diana.
I've got to stop doing that.
Hey, Donna. What's new?
Not me.
Well, now, Rochester, as long as everybody's here, why don't you go call Mr. Benny?
Yeah. Okay, here he comes now.
Hello, everybody.
Thanks for pulling that up, Zach. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Zach. That was first time I've seen that since I was probably 9, I think.
Wow, I will never tire of a joke about Dennis Day having as many children as there are windows in the house.
Stars in the sky.
Stars in the more children than there are in heaven.
Watching Jack come down those stairs just reminds me of the famous Sunshine Boys anecdote, where he was auditioning, and he did his first sort of dance on, and they said, Jack, you have to remember you're playing an 80-year-old, and he's like, but I'm 83.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Well, thank you, Neil, so much.
Thank you all for having me. It's been a delight.